In my opinion, when it comes to team-based crossover fighting games, the undisputed king is Marvel vs. Capcom. With over 20 years of fierce competition and electrifying moments, the series is a stone-cold classic in the fighting game genre, and I pretty much owe my entire channel to this series. I've been playing Marvel vs. Capcom ever since I was 4 years old in the arcade. Hell, the first game I ever played was X-Men vs. Street Fighter, and I still think this game is awesome. For the longest time, I was under the impression that this was the first game in the series and that it came after standalone Marvel and Capcom collaborations such as The Punisher and X-Men Children of the Atom. Speaking of which, Children of the Atom, or KOTA for short, is a game that I never got to play in the arcades, and with this game being featured as part of the upcoming Marvel vs. Capcom collection, I thought that now was a great time to cover it. At first glance, it may not even seem like a Marvel vs. Capcom game, what with the character roster being comprised entirely of the X-Men and their villains, but due to this game being developed by Capcom, they managed to put a little someone into the game due to a contract requirement. With the inclusion of Akuma, this technically makes KOTA the very first Marvel vs. Capcom game, and it shows. While the future games in this series incorporated a team format and they added assists, DHCs, team supers, and a refined combo system, Children of the Atom has none of this, and it makes going back to it a challenging process. That's not to say the game is bad, it's just very different to the games that came after it, and as a big fan of all of these games, even Infinite, seeing familiar characters like my guy Wolverine lose crucial moves in this game was very jarring at first, but it also made me even more interested in the game. We're here today to learn not only about the final product, but how it was created and where we are today. Get ready to choose your alter ego, because we'll be covering X-Men Children of the Atom. The story behind the creation of this game is a long one, and for transparency's sake, I'm getting my information from the Polygon article titled The Making of X-Men Children of the Atom, an Oral History, which I highly recommend reading. For starters, how did an American property like the X-Men find itself in the hands of Capcom, a Japanese company? Well, it's actually pretty simple. At the time, luckily for us, Marvel was not doing well financially, you know? They were on the rocks, really on the rocks, and they were more than willing to license us the characters quickly and easily. They were like, oh, sure, here. They were desperate for money. They were literally, they actually did file Chapter 11 in 1996, so they were desperate for cash. So they gave us X-Men, and we took it and ran with it from there. That's a quote from former Capcom USA employee Alex Jimenez, who worked on games like Alien vs. Predator and Darkstalkers. With Marvel eager to license their characters out to whoever was interested, other Japanese companies like Konami also expressed interest in the X-Men IP, and they released a beat-em-up in 1992 simply titled X-Men. This game was received well, but there lacked any representation for these iconic mutants in the fighting game department, so Capcom knew they had to jump on that, with Jimenez also stating, X-Men was something we had recommended on the US side. We recommended doing a Marvel head-to-head fighting game using superheroes. Superheroes are made to order for that, and we were told to get one of the most popular ones, and at that time, mid-90s, X-Men, they were on top of the universe. The minute I heard Capcom Japan was interested, I jumped on top of Capcom USA Senior Vice President Frank Balluz and was like, we got to do this, you know? We got to do this, I'm telling you. It's gonna make us a fortune, it's gonna be great, it will cement us. No one else has done this yet. Data East came out with a side-scroller of the Avengers. I'm like, we're gonna blow them out of the water with X-Men, because I don't know a kid out there in America now that doesn't want to be Wolverine. So we were just all over it. I pushed it and pushed it and pushed it. After Capcom Japan's executive game producer Yoshiki Okamoto successfully secured the rights to the X-Men, a die-hard Marvel fan named Katsuya Akitomo joined the company's Japanese branch. The whole reason Children of the Atom was able to get off the ground was because the comic series Marvels had come out. It was painted by Alex Ross, and I think given the content of the publication, this was the kind of comic that could inform people about American culture, right? They could see what kinds of stories were being told, and that comic books could be seen as a reflection of people's views on American culture, so I thought it was very important for me to show this to the staff at Capcom. I even translated it from English to Japanese, and after I did that, I think there was this sentiment growing within the team that they wanted to make a Marvel game, and it turned out that Capcom Japan executive producer Yoshiki Okamoto had acquired the rights to use the X-Men in a video game. We weren't sure at the time what kind of video game he wanted to make, just that he had acquired the rights, and actually at the same time, he also told me that we could use all the Marvel characters. So, with Capcom USA itching to make a game with the X-Men, and Capcom Japan successfully acquiring the rights to the series, it's a no-brainer that the game officially entered development shortly after, and Street Fighter II planner Akira Nishitani was chosen as the game's director. He was given the choice of working on Street Fighter III or X-Men, and he chose the latter, with Akitomo explaining, Nishitani had hit a point where he had done everything he could think of with the Street Fighter series. He felt that there was really nothing left he could do without making changes to the fundamentals of Street Fighter, and so if he were to be involved with it, he felt like there would be no point. With X-Men on the other hand, once Nishitani saw these characters and heard about their powers, he started getting a lot of ideas. For example, if you look at a character like Cyclops, he shoots out these wicked beams from his eyes, right? And it didn't seem like there would be opportunities to do anything like that in the Street Fighter series. I believe that the unique powers and abilities of each X-Man was a big reason as to why Capcom went through with the project, as it allowed their team to work on characters that they had never touched before in a fighting system that they had never made before. You may think that Capcom would have just slapped the X-Men characters into the Street Fighter 2 or 3 engine and just called it a day, but they went all out when designing the gameplay for Children of the Atom, and for good reason. If you compare X-Men to Street Fighter, the X-Men are mutants with special powers, so part of what we had to consider when we were designing the game was how we could take the move system in our fighting games and express the special abilities that the X-Men have and translate them into the game. While some of the characters in the Street Fighter series could be said to have superhuman powers, for the Marvel games we did, like Children of the Atom, all of the characters were defined by being mutants with superpowers, so from the get-go, we decided to try and make their special moves more intense and flashy. Capcom producer Takeshi Tezuka explains that he had to fly to New York to negotiate the game's finer details with Marvel, like who would be a part of the character roster, how the game mechanics would work, etc., and former head of creative services at Marvel, Dana Morsehead, explained that this is all pre-internet, so we had developed this very unique, longhand form of working together where we would look over the game documents, the character reference materials, which moves they do, which they couldn't do, etc. We would get these 60-page faxes, or we would get a FedEx or international shipment with a few hundred pages in it with the character animations because it was easier. They would basically handwrite the name. It might be that it was Super Pile Driver Twist, and then they would sketch it out, an actual pencil drawing of what Omega Red was going to do, or what Wolverine was going to do, and then we would go back in and tweak. Sometimes it would be fine, other times we would make little tweaks, and sometimes we'd have to adjust the names, because even though they didn't always appear on screen, the last thing we wanted was some sort of an odd name showing up in one of those reference or how-to books. Once we got that process down, it all went relatively smoothly. A huge relatively. So much work. Speaking of work, the characters in-game are voiced by the actors who were a part of the X-Men animated series. This may sound like an obvious voice casting choice, but the story of how they became involved with the game is explained in great detail by Jimenez. One thing that was funny was Capcom Japan called me up in a panic, literally less than 2 weeks before the game was supposed to be shipped. They called up in a panic saying that Marvel had turned down all the voice actors they'd come up with. All the voiceover and audio for the game had been rejected, except for the Silver Samurai. That was the only one they accepted. They rejected all the others, what are we gonna do? I was like, well, who did you get to do the voice actors? Oh, we got English-speaking people. I'm like, were they Japanese? They have accents, you know. You can't have Wolverine with a Japanese accent, it just doesn't work. They wanted me to talk to Marvel and get Marvel to go with it. I'm like, look, they're not going to, no matter what you do, so let me see what I can do. Then I called up the head of licensing at Marvel at the time, a gentleman named Joe Calamari. I said, Joe, who does the voiceover work for the animated X-Men cartoon? And he's like, oh, it's a group up in Canada, they're really helpful. You want me to set you up? I'm like, yeah, please, may I get their number? So I called them up, I told them who I was, what I was trying to do, and the woman up there was wonderful. She was the head of, it was called Dome Productions up there in Toronto. And they said, okay, which ones do you need? And I told her which characters I needed. Okay, well, we can get you these characters plus the studio time. Would $5,000 be too much? $5,000 for all the characters and the studio time? Canadian? I was like, oh, and I immediately set it all up, and I called Capcom localization manager Tom Shiraiwa in Japan. I said, hey, tell the guys to pack their bags, we're going to Canada. He's like, what do you mean? I go, we're gonna go this Thursday. Are you sure they're going to approve these voices? I go, yeah, because we're using the characters they actually have already, so they're already present. Joe Calamari has already assured me they are pre-approved. I think that's an amazingly funny story, and it blows my mind that someone called Joe Calamari helped get the game out on time. Now that we know how the game was made, let's analyze the gameplay of Children of the Atom. Due to how old this game is, it's a bit challenging to find reliable information, but I did manage to find an old guide on game FAQs that was written in the late 90s that explained some of the more obscure or confusing gameplay mechanics, so I feel that we're in good hands here. For starters, this is a 6-button fighting game, much like Darkstalkers, and you can walk, dash, crouch, jump, super jump, etc. So right from the series' inception, Marvel vs. Capcom had the dynamic movement options that we know today. Characters also have multiple special moves, although because this is the first game in the series, some of the iconic ones aren't here. For example, I love playing as Wolverine in pretty much every Marvel vs. Capcom game, so trying him out here was a no-brainer. Imagine how surprised I was when I found out that Berserker Barrage, his forward-moving aggression tool, isn't in the game. He has the super version of it, but the base special move is nowhere to be found. Another example involves Storm, and while she still does have her Hailstorm super, look how slow it is to come out in this game. It lasts forever and does some really good chip damage, but the startup is crazy. It goes without saying that many characters in this game have big differences when compared to how they function in future games, and that also goes for Children of the Atom's Magic series. If you don't know, Magic series is a term used to describe the overall combo structure of these games, and it's sort of like Gatlings and Guilty Gear. You can chain normals together into a launcher or a special move to perform a free-form combo, and this system encourages creativity as it gives you the tools to essentially freestyle and find a combo that works for you. In future games, launching an opponent into the air and then keeping the combo going is really easy, but in Children of the Atom, trying to perfectly time an aerial attack after a launcher is easier said than done. Capcom hadn't quite figured out the timing and momentum that your character should have when they leap into the air, so it's difficult to land a hit in this situation because your move will often whiff. But if you're playing Wolverine like me, that's okay, because instead of launching, you can do a very short combo into a guaranteed stun. Yep, that's right, this game has a stun mechanic. While it was removed in Marvel vs. Capcom 3, the games that came after this game also allow you to stun the enemy, usually after a massive combo, but here, you can just do crouching heavy punch, crouching heavy kick, heavy drill claw, and that's it. Stunning the enemy allows you to hit them with whatever you want, including a point-blank super, and this always feels amazing. Speaking of supers, they're tied to the meter at the top, and you may have noticed that there are multiple levels. Level 1 doesn't introduce any changes, Level 2 lets you perform not only safety rolls and throw techs but also your special moves, and Level 3 lets you perform your supers, which are called Hyper X moves. Having throw teching and special moves being locked behind meter is the prime example of this being an old school Marvel vs. Capcom game, and I'm really glad that this was changed for future games. Another interesting quirk is that you can perform Magic series combos without even hitting the opponent. For example, if I whiff a big standing heavy kick launcher with Wolverine, I'd be open to getting punished, right? But if I cancel it on whiff into standing light punch, this move becomes infinitely harder to punish due to how fast the recovery has now become, and it makes characters like Wolverine able to stay safe in neutral when throwing out big buttons. Children of the Atom also features these awesome looking stage transitions, and while these aren't a part of every stage, the ones that do have it are awesome. By knocking the enemy into the ground, you can send them flying towards the bottom, but unlike a game like Tekken for example, where this will trigger a cinematic, you can actually keep moving around and hitting the opponent in the air in Children of the Atom. This allows you to perform infinite combos and touch of deaths, and while I have nowhere near the amount of skill needed to pull one of these off, they are always exciting to watch. Overall, Children of the Atom is a very high damage fighting game that constantly moves at a breakneck speed. When it was released in late 1994 in Japan and early 1995 elsewhere in the arcades, Children of the Atom was a smash hit, going on to become the most popular arcade game at the time in America, as well as cracking the top 5 most popular games in Japan in February. Reviewers loved the colourful graphics, the character roster, and the voice samples found within, and they agreed that it felt like a proper X-Men title with genuine effort put into it. The game was also released for the Sega Saturn and the PC, and while the PC version received decent reviews, the Sega Saturn version was where it's at. Due to this port having all the characters, moves, and animations of the original arcade release, it was a critical darling, and it ended up becoming one of the best Saturn fighting games at the time. A few years after the arcade and Saturn release, however, Children of the Atom was also ported to the PS1, albeit with some missing animation frames. This version tanked, and I don't think anyone liked it because the reviews are horrible. This version of the game came out in 1996, and it took so long to release because of numerous technical issues involved with porting the game to the PS1, which couldn't do 2D games very well due to it being specifically designed for 3D graphics. Going back to the Polygon article for a moment, some Capcom staff who worked on the game revealed that when Children of the Atom released, many people didn't actually like the combo system because apparently it was too overwhelming and confusing. They wanted it to be more like Street Fighter with a more reined-in combo system, but boy am I glad that Capcom didn't listen to them and instead expanded on the insanity for future games. Titles like X-Men vs Street Fighter, Marvel Super Heroes vs Street Fighter, and Marvel vs Capcom 1 wouldn't exist if not for Children of the Atom being a massive success for both Capcom and for Marvel. It's funny how that we all love the super jumps and the high damage, fast-paced combos, etc., but back then they didn't like it, and it kind of reminds me of that Marty McFly meme. X-Men Mania in the 90s was going into overdrive at this point in time, and I'd like to think that Children of the Atom helped out with that, at least in the video game world. All of the classic Marvel vs Capcom games that we know and love owe their existence to this game, and classic Capcom sprites like Wolverine, Cyclops, Storm, etc. all originate from this game too. Overall, while it hasn't aged perfectly, Children of the Atom is still a really engaging and unique fighting game with an interesting, yet oftentimes stressful development cycle. I had a blast researching the creation of this game and documenting it in video format, and I hope you had fun watching. There are plenty of things in Children of the Atom that made their way into future games, like the stage transitions making it into X-Men vs Street Fighter for example, and I'm really happy that this game was a huge success. Marvel vs Capcom was a big part of my childhood, so going back to explore the very first title in detail felt really special to me. Many of the game's creators are no longer with Marvel or Capcom, but I'm sure that they're pleased that the series continued for many years to come, and I can't wait to bring the game with me to locals via the Marvel vs Capcom collection. Who knows, maybe the series will return and we'll get a Marvel vs Capcom 4 one day. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.